On a cool autumn morning in Asheville, North Carolina, the discovery of Judge Richard Grayson shattered the tranquility of the town. Richard Grayson was not only a respected figure in the legal community, but a symbol of justice. As his body lay sprawled across the floor of an old, remote hunting lodge, the signs of a violent struggle were evident. Broken glass littered the room, and splatters of blood led to a grisly scene investigators would later call calculated and chilling. Yet, the circumstances behind his death would uncover much darker, hidden obsessions and broken boundaries that had remained silent for too long. Judge Grayson, known to Asheville's citizens as a fair yet stringent figure, had built his reputation on upholding law and order. But beneath his stern public image, Grayson held secrets that would unspool into a harrowing tale. At the heart of this unraveling was a young woman named Laura Hayes, the daughter of Asheville's Sheriff Marcus Hayes, whose beauty and charm had inadvertently ensnared the judge's attention. Despite her best intentions to keep the relationship at a friendly distance, Laura, then 24, became the subject of Grayson's increasingly possessive obsession. Grayson's fixation on Laura began innocently, sparked at a social gathering where the judge, already a prominent 49-year-old, was introduced to her. Laura's youthful spirit and disarming nature intrigued him, igniting a fervor that evolved into an affair. Initially concealed from friends and family, the affair ran quietly for a few months. Grayson, a man of influence and wealth, lavished Laura with gifts and constant attention, but his feelings quickly grew overwhelming. He seemed intoxicated by her presence, an obsession that intensified over time. When Laura began to notice Richard's controlling tendencies, she tried to disengage, fearing the consequences of his possessiveness. She confided in close friends about her concern, and soon after, she began spending time with Sam Taylor, a local artist whose easygoing charm offered her a reprieve from the oppressive relationship with Grayson. But this relationship only intensified the judge's jealousy, as he could not bear the thought of Laura with anyone else. The young artist became a source of both envy and hatred for Grayson, who saw him as an obstacle standing between him and Laura. Laura's father, Sheriff Marcus Hayes, was a man respected throughout Asheville for his unwavering sense of justice and deep-rooted community ties. He began noticing his daughter's unease and soon pieced together the uncomfortable truth. He suspected that Grayson, his longtime associate in law enforcement, had crossed personal boundaries with Laura. The betrayal ran deep. Marcus Hayes had trusted Grayson both professionally and as a confidant. His concern soon escalated into confrontation as he confronted the judge over his intentions toward Laura. But Grayson, unperturbed by Hayes' anger, issued veiled threats, hinting at his power and influence, both of which he wielded to maintain his control over Laura. The relationship between Grayson and Laura had now become a ticking time bomb, one that would soon set off an irreversible chain of events. Sheriff Hayes grew more desperate to keep his daughter safe, while Laura struggled to evade Grayson's constant attempts to monitor her. Meanwhile, Grayson, feeling cornered and betrayed, became ever more consumed with dark thoughts of how to eliminate the barriers between him and the object of his obsession. As Judge Richard Grayson's obsession deepened, his behavior grew erratic, and he began showing signs of desperation that would later prove fatal. Surveillance footage captured him pacing outside Laura's favorite cafe, watching her every move. He spent hours in his office alone, replaying her words in his mind, analyzing every detail of her friendship with Sam Taylor. The isolation began to gnaw at him, and soon he crossed a line he could never retreat from. He hatched a plan to remove Laura's father from the equation. In the days leading up to the murder, Grayson visited a hardware store on the outskirts of Asheville, purchasing gloves, rope, and a hunting knife. Surveillance footage confirmed his presence there, as did receipts he carelessly left behind. It became clear to Detective Thomas Blake, the lead investigator on the case, that Grayson was preparing for something sinister. Still, what lay ahead was unimaginable to those who had known the judge as a man of integrity and honor. Behind closed doors, he was transforming into someone driven by primal impulses and devoid of remorse. Sheriff Hayes, on the other hand, was growing increasingly suspicious of Grayson's intentions. Though he had no proof, his instincts told him that the judge had darker motives, and he became especially vigilant. Laura was warned to keep her distance from Grayson, and her father had taken measures to monitor her movements more closely. But Grayson's influence within Asheville's legal circles made it difficult for the sheriff to openly confront him. He found himself caught in a moral conundrum, struggling between protecting his daughter and avoiding a public scandal. In the early morning hours on a cold October day, Judge Grayson put his plan into motion. He lured Sheriff Hayes to a remote location outside Asheville, claiming he had information that could implicate a high-ranking city official in a bribery scheme. Hayes, ever the diligent officer, went alone, thinking he was uncovering a case of corruption. But as he stepped into the secluded lodge, he sensed the trap too late. Grayson, who had arrived earlier, lay in wait, his demeanor calm and detached as he watched Hayes cross the threshold. Detective Thomas Blake, the head of the Asheville investigative team, was alerted when the sheriff did not report back after several hours. A search ensued, eventually leading Blake's team to the abandoned hunting lodge where the sheriff's vehicle was discovered, parked but empty. Inside, they uncovered Sheriff Hayes' body, bearing multiple stab wounds in what appeared to be a premeditated and brutal assault. Grayson's plan was simple and chilling. He believed that, with Hayes out of the way, Laura would have no choice but to turn to him for protection. But Grayson's underestimation of Detective Blake would be his undoing. The detective, who had been in Asheville's force for over 20 years, was not easily swayed or intimidated. Immediately recognizing the inconsistencies surrounding Grayson's alibi, Blake began combing through evidence, starting with the surveillance footage from the hardware store and the receipts Grayson had left behind. As the pieces began to fall into place, Grayson sensed the walls closing in. He could no longer maintain his facade of calm authority, and his once unshakable composure started to crack. Every piece of evidence Blake uncovered exposed the judge's descent into madness, a fixation so powerful it had cost a good man his life. But, for Detective Blake, the hardest task still lay ahead: to confront a man of law and order who had forsaken everything for the sake of an obsession that had turned deadly. Detective Thomas Blake knew that Asheville would be shaken to its core by the revelations he was about to unearth. For a respected judge like Richard Grayson, to be implicated in the brutal murder of Sheriff Marcus Hayes was a notion almost too outrageous to believe. Yet the evidence was stacking up, and the details were grotesquely clear. The discovery of Hayes' body at the lodge was a grim turning point, and it left Blake with an unrelenting determination to see the case through. Blake's first stop was the hardware store where Grayson had been captured on surveillance, meticulously gathering items that could only serve one purpose: murder. There was the rope, the gloves, and the hunting knife, each item purchased with the methodical precision of a man who knew how to cover his tracks. But Blake also noticed the arrogance in Grayson's actions. The judge hadn't taken care to avoid cameras, hadn't concealed his identity. It was as if Grayson believed his status would shield him, that no one would dare question his movements or intentions. This attitude had left a damning trail, one Blake was now determined to follow to the end. In a break from the investigation room, Blake sat in his office reviewing Grayson's finances. Bank records revealed that Grayson had recently withdrawn a large sum of money. At first, Blake thought it might have been used to pay off someone, perhaps even a hired hand to carry out the grisly act. But as he dug deeper, he realized that Grayson had taken this amount on his own, likely with the intent to flee or bribe his way out of trouble if the need arose. Grayson's financial dealings told a story of desperation, one that intensified as Laura Hayes had begun to pull away from him. Blake couldn't help but consider the emotional strain this revelation would have on Laura. She had been the catalyst of this twisted affair, albeit unintentionally, and now had to face the knowledge that her father's death was a direct result of Grayson's unhealthy obsession. He resolved to meet with her, both to inform her of the findings and to understand the depth of her involvement with Grayson. When Blake arrived at Laura's home, she was visibly shaken, her face pale and eyes distant, haunted by the horrific chain of events that had ensnared her. She recounted the evolution of her relationship with Grayson, the gifts, the constant messages, the way his behavior shifted from charming to controlling. Laura had initially dismissed it as typical infatuation, but she soon began to feel the darker edge beneath his attention. When she distanced herself, Grayson's demeanor turned menacing. He became possessive, his jealousy seething, especially when he noticed her budding friendship with Sam Taylor, the local artist who had offered her a much-needed escape from the judge's stifling presence. Armed with Laura's testimony, Blake's suspicions crystallized. Grayson's obsession wasn't merely a crush gone too far. It was a pathological need for control, one that had escalated to a murderous rage. But Blake knew he needed more concrete evidence that would withstand the scrutiny of court and crush any defense Grayson might try to mount. He returned to his desk, poring over phone records, witness statements, and surveillance footage until he found exactly what he needed: a trail of incriminating data that left no doubt about Grayson's guilt. Blake's breakthrough came from a series of phone calls made in the days leading up to the murder. Analysis of Grayson's phone logs revealed a disturbing pattern: late-night calls to burner numbers, messages to unidentified contacts, and repeated calls to Laura, often unanswered. Each call painted a portrait of a man growing more desperate and unhinged, unable to accept that he was losing control of the situation. Blake's team worked tirelessly to identify the burner phone numbers Grayson had been in contact with, leading them to a local supplier known to sell prepaid, untraceable devices. When Blake questioned the vendor, he confirmed that Grayson had indeed purchased a burner phone under a false name, a critical piece of evidence that tied him directly to planning the crime. Grayson's facade of respectability was crumbling, layer by layer, exposing the dark intentions lurking beneath. The next step in Blake's investigation involved speaking with Sam Taylor. The young artist's connection to Laura was a constant thorn in Grayson's side, and Blake suspected Taylor might hold insights into the judge's erratic behavior in the weeks before the murder. When questioned, Taylor revealed his own chilling encounter with Grayson, a confrontation at a gallery event where Grayson had warned him to stay away from Laura, his tone laced with veiled threat. Taylor, dismissing the judge as a jealous suitor, had laughed it off. But in hindsight, Taylor's face grew pale as he realized the gravity of that warning. Armed with this new information, Blake began building a psychological profile of Grayson, analyzing every aspect of his life, from his public persona to the meticulously curated private world he had created around his obsession with Laura. The judge's actions grew increasingly sinister under scrutiny. Each step was calculated, each interaction with Laura a careful manipulation designed to make her dependent on him and afraid to leave. Blake saw it all too clearly. Grayson was willing to eliminate anyone he perceived as a threat, even if that meant committing murder. By now, Blake's evidence was overwhelming. Grayson had stalked Laura, threatened her friends, and ultimately killed her father, all in the name of an obsession he could not control. When Blake and his team presented their findings to Asheville's district attorney, the reaction was one of disbelief and horror. A judge, a man entrusted with upholding justice, had become a criminal of the worst kind, one willing to destroy innocent lives in pursuit of his twisted desires. With a mountain of evidence pointing to Judge Richard Grayson's guilt, Detective Thomas Blake knew it was time to act. The arrest had to be swift and unambiguous. There could be no opportunity for Grayson to manipulate the situation or sway public opinion in his favor. On a crisp October morning, Asheville's courthouse became the scene of an unprecedented scandal as Blake's team moved in to arrest Grayson in his chambers, a place where he had once ruled with authority and impartiality. As officers escorted the judge away in handcuffs, the courthouse fell silent, stunned by the fall of a man they had all respected. Grayson's reaction was one of eerie calm. He maintained his composure, his gaze fixed, his expression a mask of cold indifference. He didn't resist or protest. Instead, he simply followed the officers, as though already resigned to his fate. But to Detective Blake, this calm was not a sign of innocence, it was a sign of Grayson's disturbing detachment, a chilling indication of his willingness to justify anything in his pursuit of Laura Hayes. The interrogation began in the stark, fluorescent lit room at the Asheville Police Department. Grayson's calm demeanor persisted, his face betraying little as Blake and his partner presented the evidence, the receipts from the hardware store, the surveillance footage, the burner phone records, and the testimony from both Laura and Sam Taylor. Piece by piece, they laid out the judge's web of lies until Grayson's self-assured composure began to erode. Under the weight of the evidence and Blake's relentless questioning, Grayson finally broke. With a strained voice, he admitted to orchestrating the murder of Sheriff Marcus Hayes, detailing his twisted reasoning as if he were making a closing argument in a courtroom. He explained that Marcus Hayes had been an obstacle between him and Laura, a man unwilling to see the love they shared. Grayson claimed that eliminating Hayes was the only way to protect Laura from her father's supposed interference. In Grayson's mind, his actions were those of a tragic lover rather than a violent predator, a twisted rationalization that chilled everyone in the interrogation room. Grayson's confession was thorough, devoid of remorse, and disturbingly detailed. He described luring Hayes to the lodge with the story of a fabricated corruption case, knowing the sheriff's dedication would compel him to investigate. Grayson recounted each step he had taken to ensure Hayes would be alone, defenseless, and unsuspecting. The judge even admitted to practicing with the hunting knife, rehearsing each move he would make once Hayes arrived. His words were clinical, as though he were recounting a scripted performance rather than a brutal, cold-blooded murder. Blake knew that this confession was enough to put Grayson away for life. He had achieved what he had set out to do. He had exposed Grayson for who he truly was and secured justice for Sheriff Marcus Hayes. But the details of the confession left him unsettled. Grayson's delusions ran deeper than Blake had anticipated, revealing a mind that had warped reality to suit its desires, even to the point of justifying murder. As the news of Judge Richard Grayson's arrest spread, Asheville citizens were plunged into shock and disbelief. The trial that followed became a spectacle, drawing media attention from across the state and casting a harsh spotlight on the town's judicial system. Crowds gathered daily outside the courthouse, reporters huddled together as they relayed updates, and the courtroom filled with spectators eager to witness the trial of a man who had once been the embodiment of justice in their community. The prosecution, led by a seasoned district attorney, determined to see Grayson punished, meticulously outlined the judge's obsession with Laura Hayes and the steps he had taken to eliminate her father. They presented the hardware store receipts, surveillance footage, and testimony from Detective Blake, each piece meticulously painting a portrait of Grayson's jealousy-fueled descent into madness. When Laura Hayes took the stand, the room fell silent as she described the lengths Grayson had gone to in his efforts to control her life, leaving the courtroom spellbound by her words and visibly shaken by her ordeal. The defense, however, attempted a different strategy, painting Grayson as a man who had simply lost his way, a victim of his own emotions who had succumbed to a moment of insanity. They argued that he had been under immense personal and professional pressure, and that the intense stress had clouded his judgment, leading to the fatal confrontation with Sheriff Hayes. But Blake knew, and the evidence confirmed, that Grayson's actions were not impulsive. They were calculated, carefully planned, and executed with a chilling clarity of purpose. Throughout the trial, Grayson remained composed, occasionally nodding as witnesses recounted his actions. But when he was given the chance to testify, his calm cracked, revealing a hint of the man who had once wielded immense power and believed himself untouchable. In a final attempt to sway the jury, Grayson painted himself as a misunderstood romantic, claiming that his actions were motivated by profound love and a desire to protect Laura from unfit influences. His words, however, only underscored the depth of his obsession, making it clear to the jury that Grayson's motives were anything but noble and deeply rooted in control rather than love. The prosecution's closing argument was a brutal dissection of Grayson's motives, reminding the jury that he had meticulously planned Sheriff Hayes' murder and left a trail of evidence that pointed to his intent to eliminate anyone standing between him and Laura. They portrayed Grayson not as a lovesick man driven by passion, but as a predator who manipulated his status to rationalize his own desires, disregarding the lives he destroyed. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Grayson's sentence was swift and unyielding: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs, and Laura Hayes, seated among supporters, closed her eyes, relief mixing with sorrow as she absorbed the weight of the verdict. The town of Asheville, reeling from the dark secrets exposed in this trial, would never be quite the same. The trial's conclusion brought a measure of closure to Asheville, but the scars left by Judge Richard Grayson's crime ran deep. In the weeks following the verdict, the community struggled to reconcile the once revered judge with the killer they now knew him to be. The courthouse staff who had worked under Grayson's authority were especially shaken. Many spoke of their disbelief that the man they respected had harbored such a sinister double life. Laura Hayes, meanwhile, was left with a void that nothing seemed able to fill. Losing her father had been devastating, but discovering the extent of Grayson's obsession and the lengths he was willing to go to possess her had left her feeling trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Her role in unknowingly provoking Grayson's jealousy haunted her, despite knowing logically that she bore no blame. Asheville had become suffocating, every corner of the town holding memories of her father, of Grayson, of the events that had irrevocably changed her life. Under the guise of needing a break, Laura quietly moved to a neighboring town. Friends and acquaintances offered their sympathies, but she withdrew from them, craving solitude. She didn't go to the press, refusing to let her story be sensationalized any further. Instead, she spent her days in therapy, slowly working to heal from the traumatic entanglement she had been unwillingly thrust into. However, her father's murder weighed heavily on her, a reminder of the dark consequences of Grayson's obsession and the unbridgeable gap it had left in her life. Detective Thomas Blake, too, felt a lingering unease. In his 20 years on the force, he had encountered dozens of violent cases, but Grayson stood out. The judge's carefully constructed facade and his brazen belief that he could act without consequence reminded Blake how easily people in positions of power could manipulate the system to their own ends. Although Grayson was now behind bars, Blake found himself wondering how many other trusted figures held secrets as disturbing as Grayson's. The case had instilled in him a renewed sense of vigilance, a reminder of the unseen darkness that could lurk behind any polished exterior. Richard Grayson's transition from the respected halls of the courthouse to the sterile confines of prison was brutal. Accustomed to a life of influence and control, Grayson found himself in a world where his authority was meaningless. His former colleagues now regarded him with contempt, and in prison he quickly became the target of disdain from both inmates and guards. The other inmates, some of whom had experienced Grayson's rulings firsthand, took particular satisfaction in seeing him fall from grace. To the outside world, Grayson had faded into obscurity, a fallen judge lost to the shadowy confines of the penitentiary. But inside, he continued to fight, refusing to let go of the distorted love he still clung to in his mind. Guards reported that he would sometimes speak to himself about Laura, mumbling incoherent statements that hinted at his enduring obsession. In his cell, he wrote letters he could never send, describing his feelings for her, as if she might one day read them and understand his sacrifice. Grayson's cell soon became a twisted shrine of his obsession, a place where he maintained the delusion that Laura might somehow forgive him, even love him, if only she could see his true intentions. The letters never left his cell, but rumors of them spread through the prison, adding to the aura of derangement surrounding the former judge. Grayson's mental state deteriorated as he became increasingly unhinged, lashing out at guards, screaming into the night about conspiracies and the injustice he claimed to suffer. What had started as an obsession for control and possession had, in the confines of his cell, grown into a full-blown psychosis.